we can all remember what we've been doing the last days. We've looked at really 3 different concepts, and we want to try and tie them all together. If not in this presentation, certainly in tomorrow's. We looked at the line of the Nethinims, or the world, compared and contrasted it with our reform line, both the ploughing and the history of their harvest, latter rain harvest. So we took this history, their ploughing, 14 to 19, and we compared and contrasted that with the history of our latter rain, which exists in the same dispensation, and then we compared and contrasted it with our ploughing experience, because this is their ploughing experience of the Nethinims. So on 2 levels. We left that study, and then we did the whole history of the counterfeit. We did the counterfeit from their Alpha history, 2 world wars, lined over Millerite history, the space in between, and then we went into the Omega history. So lining up 1989 with our internal 1888, then lining up our 1989, the movement time of the end, with their time of the end, 2001. And then we traced this Omega of modern Babylon from 2001 through 2005, 2013, the empowerment of the second angel for them, transfer of leadership, to this dispensation of 14 to 19, then that being Raphia, then Panium, then Sunday law when they go to the world. So we've dealt with the reform line of the Nethinims, then we've dealt with the counterfeit, and now we're touching on World War I. Is everyone okay with that? Do we have any questions or thoughts? So I just want to quickly go through the Third Diadochi War. We began it yesterday. We looked at the history, really it's the end of the Second War. The Second War is Antigonus versus Eumenes, 2 superpowers. And who are they? Who do they represent? Antigonus is King of the North, United States. Eumenes, Soviet Union, King of the South. At the Battle of Gabini, Eumenes is defeated from the inside, and we know that the Soviet Union was defeated from the inside. The United States had 2 allies in this history. Antigonus had the allies of Python and Seleucus, and they represent Python, the Mujahideen, and Seleucus, the papacy, John Paul II. Python fought as a member of Antigonus's army as one of his generals. Seleucus did not. He was more moral support. So the Mujahideen fought on behalf of the United States in Afghanistan over that 10-year proxy war. John Paul II and the papacy never fought in that army. They had a different role to play. But you see that the United States still had 2 allies. The Mujahideen become more powerful after the Soviet Union pulls out of Afghanistan. And what do they become? The Taliban. And what year do they take control of the government in Afghanistan? 1996. Now we're not overlaying this with World War I, we're just keeping to the Third Diadochi War, but we reminded ourselves that when we talked about World War I, we have the rise of the terrorist organisation, the Black Hand, and they strike Austria-Hungary, the 2-horned power here. But here we're talking about the Third Diadochi War. You have the Mujahideen become the Taliban, become powerful. The United States feel threatened by the Taliban, and what do they do in 2001? They go into Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban government. The Afghanistan war began here and is still going in 19 years later. Just as Antigonus became threatened by Python and had him killed. In this history we read about the relationship between Antigonus and Seleucus. Seleucus flees Babylon. He gives up his territory and power, and he flees to Ptolemy, the king of the south, and he begins to plot against Antigonus. Their relationship is broken down because Antigonus is acting like a dictator. And then we trace the history of the United States and their alliance to the papacy. And how did that relationship develop after 1989? The relationship between the United States and John Paul II. By 1990, how is it going? Not well. And why is it? Why was it visibly not going well? What happened that started to turn the two against each other? You can raise your hand. I can't hear you. Brother Rogers? The Gulf War, 1990-91, you have the Gulf War, and John Paul II, did he support the Gulf War? No, and he goes to the United States and says to the government, don't go to war with Iraq, and do they listen to him? No. So his past is used by date. He's been as useful as he's going to be for the United States in taking down the Soviet Union, and by 1990, he's no longer useful, so they start ignoring his advice. And a brother also reminded us yesterday of John Paul II's plans for Eastern Europe. What were they? What plans did he have for Eastern Europe?
He wanted to destroy the king of the south, and he wanted to turn all the Eastern Europe to his side.
He wanted to turn all of Eastern Europe to his side. He wanted them to follow the moral authority of the Catholic Church. And do they do that? No. They align themselves with capitalist West. So he feels that Eastern Europe has betrayed him and the United States has betrayed him. And he's known in this history, in perhaps the best biographical book written about John Paul II, the chapters that deal with the history after the fall of the Soviet Union. That whole section is titled The Angry Pope. He became known as the Angry Pope. He was so angry that people stopped coming to his rallies. Before he would travel, and we read in South America, he would get a crowd of 5 million people to hear him speak. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in those rallies, he just started yelling at everyone for their mistakes, for not listening to him. He lost a lot of his attraction. And it went down from 5 million to sometimes just a few thousand. So he lost a great deal of his following in that history. Then we went through the Afghanistan war. He spoke against that. And then we came to the Iraq war. The Third Diadochi War. Antigonus is acting like a dictator. 3 allies send him an ultimatum saying, stop acting like a dictator. Cassander, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. We find that after 2001, 3 allies also send the United States an ultimatum to stop acting like a dictatorship. And who were they? France, Germany, and Russia. They're telling the United States that it has to operate through the United Nations, as decreed by international law. Does the United States listen? So in 2003, they violate international law, they bypass these 3, and Antigonus invades the sphere of influence of Ptolemy, or the United States invades the sphere of influence of who? Iraq came under whose sphere of influence? Russia. So this is the 2003 Iraq War. Antigonus invades the sphere of influence of Ptolemy. He isn't invading Egypt. He's invading the territories along the, up through where you picture Israel and up through Col Syria, all that strip. That's what he takes from Ptolemy. So Antigonus takes all of that down towards Egypt, and then he takes all of that territory, and then he leaves his son Demetrius to hold it. So he has all of that territory, he leaves Demetrius to hold that territory, and Ptolemy marches out to fight against Demetrius. So if we were to draw that. This is Egypt. This is the territory of Israel and Col Syria. Antigonus has taken all of this, and down here you have Gaza, and he's left his son Demetrius holding this territory. Ptolemy marches out of Egypt to fight against Demetrius. And what do the generals of Demetrius tell him? Don't fight. So Demetrius has never fought in a battle without his father. He's completely inexperienced. And what is Ptolemy's experience? One of the leading generals of Alexander the Great. He's been powerful since before the death of Alexander. So he's a formidable general to fight, and Demetrius has never fought a battle alone. So the generals tell Demetrius, do not fight him. And what does Demetrius do? Fights him anyway. So at the Battle of Gaza, you have the defeat of Demetrius, and he fought against the advice of his generals. And he's completely annihilated in that battle. His army is crushed. Battle of Gaza, what other name is this battle known as? It's the Battle of Raphia. Not the Battle of Raphia from Daniel 11, but this is also called the Battle of Raphia, because this territory of Gaza is also known as Raphia. So you have the Battle of Raphia, and Demetrius, the king of the north, the United States, is defeated by Ptolemy, defeated by Russia, and Donald Trump fought against the advice of his generals, yes? What did Donald Trump's generals tell him to do? He was not to remove his troops from Afghanistan. He was not to surrender Syria. He was to take a hard line on Ukraine, a hard line on Venezuela, and Donald Trump capitulated to Vladimir Putin against the advice of his generals. We're all okay with that without going into the history. I heard a no. Who said no? My brother. So we're lining this up with 2019 and the Battle of Raphia. Is that okay? Yes. Demetrius, who represents the king of the north here, he fought against the king of the south, Ptolemy, against the advice of his generals. So all the aged, experienced generals in his army told him to not fight the king of the south. And we know that when we came to 2019, the history leading up to it, and then the closing months of 2019, what are the leading experienced generals in Donald Trump's administration, what have they been telling him? Can we raise our hands? I just can't find your face otherwise. Brother. Don't withdraw your troops from Syria. So that's just one example, but it's the key one, really. So Donald Trump's generals tell him to not surrender Syria to Russia. Does that make sense? They all tell him that. Who was the main general telling him that? What leading general told him that? John Bolton. And what does John Bolton do? September 9. September 9, he resigns. Donald Trump won't let him. So September 10, Donald Trump fires him. And then September 11, John Bolton's allies in the White House all quit. So his generals start leaving in the final months of 2019, his remaining generals, because Donald Trump keeps going against their counsel. The thorn in John Bolton's side was Syria and Ukraine. So Donald Trump, the decisions that he made in 2019 that gave the victory to Russia were all made against the advice of all of his generals. Does that make sense? So we have 2019, the Battle of Gaza. You have Ptolemy. He takes back all of his sphere of influence. Again, they're not fighting over Russia. Sorry, they're not fighting over Egypt or Russia. He takes back this sphere of influence. Ptolemy marches up, defeats Demetrius at Gaza, takes all of this territory. And then what does Antigonus do? Antigonus comes, he joins his son Demetrius, and now they fight together. And Antigonus comes down and he retakes all of this territory, all the way to where? All the way to the borders of Egypt. So from here to here, you have Antigonus going to the borders. Where have we seen that before? To the borders? That's Daniel 11, what we line up with 1989. And what does it mean when you go to the borders? Hey, Brad? You go to the fortress? What does that mean, Sister Elizabeth? What does it mean to go to the fortress or to the borders? So we have this verse in Daniel 11 that says that the king of the north, he goes to the borders, takes everything back to the borders of the king of the south. And we line that up in application with 1989. Does anyone know what we mean when we say that? It's taken all of his spheres of influence. Does that make sense? So they went to the borders here, they took all the sphere of influence, but in 1989 did they take Russia? No. So they go to the borders. They don't need to physically overthrow the home country. So when Antigonus comes to the borders here, and we line this up with Panium, if I do that in red. We know that even when we come to this waymark, what is the king of the north taking from the king of the south? Spheres of influence. So we come to Panium, the king of the north has retaken all of that territory. He's wanting to invade and take Egypt itself, and what stops him? Two things. First is the Nabateans, and who are they? Who are the Nabateans? Descendants of Ishmael, Islam. So Islam stops him, and who else? Seleucus. What has Seleucus gone and done? And Seleucus represents? So he has two threats in this time, the activities of Islam and the activities of the papacy. Does that make sense? The activities of the Nabateans and the activities of Seleucus. So what does Antigonus do? What does the king of the north do? He signs the peace of the dynasties. A peace treaty with who? Cassander, Lysimachus and Ptolemy. But most relevant for our story, this is Ptolemy. He makes peace with his enemies. Those enemies he's fighting. But does he make peace with Seleucus? No, because he has an agenda. Now he's going to wage war with Seleucus. And from this waymark, you have the Babylonian War. Bringing us to the Sunday law. And at this waymark, at the end of the Babylonian War, what is established? The Seleucid dynasty. How powerful is Seleucus here? He's retaken Babylon, he's established his dynasty. How powerful is he? He's established. Do we all know of the Seleucus's campaigns east? When he goes right into the east, right up to near India. He goes into treaties with those prominent kings. He gets all of those, estimated about 400 war elephants. His massive easterly campaign that he undertakes just soon after this. Are we all familiar with that? So after he establishes the Seleucid dynasty here, he's established, but he's still going to rise more. That's when he campaigns easterly. He does a massive work. He goes east, he goes into alliances, defeats kings, goes into alliances with kings, marries their daughters, takes their technology, and gathers 400 war elephants. He comes back at the Battle of Ipsus just in time to wipe out Antigonus. Does that make sense? Brother Rogers? Yes. For those that don't know what that means, do you want to give some more information? So this is, Brother Rogers has reminded us that this is the death of the Aegean dynasty. The final hope of continuing Alexander's lineage is gone when Cassander has the last heir and former, I don't know if she was wife or not, or mistress of Alexander the Great. Cassander just has any remaining member of that family killed. So it's the end of Alexander the Great's dynasty entirely, which we can also line up with the King of the North. Do we have any comments on this so far? Thoughts? Yes.
I've never thought about it. I was just thinking when you said it's the end of Aegean dynasty. So I was trying to look in the previous understanding of who is Alexander. So we know the story of Antigonus. Like Antigonus is like the ancestor, one of those who wanted to make the empire. And I see where you're marking the end of Aegean dynasty. You know that at different levels you can mark the end of the fall of the republic and on. And you know that it's a progressive history where you can mark Sunday towards the end. And you claim Aegean dynasty, Alexander is the ancestor. Seleucus was the mindset of creating the empire. And that is where we have the head, or democracy is forever born when we get to the Sunday.
So Brother Dennis is reminding us of an old study where we look at the Battle of Ipsus and we show that Antigonus is someone who is like the ancestor or Alexander the Great. So Antigonus, he represents the United States, and he's like the ancestor Alexander. They can both represent the United States. So when we see, first of all, if we want to fully unpack that, what it means, the death of Alexander, Antigonus kind of being a continuation of the same entity, we need to understand the First and Second Diadochi War. I don't know if we're all accustomed to nothing being a coincidence, but we have 4 Diadochi Wars and we've only unpacked 2. So that's by no means a complete study, but we know that Alexander and Antigonus Antigonus is a continuation of Alexander the Great. So at the Sunday law, where we mark the breaking of the Republican horn, we're also marking the end of the Aegean dynasty. The end of the dynasty of Alexander the Great comes to its final destruction end. I think, a relevant point. So I just wanted us to fly through the history of the Third Diadochi War for the purpose of picking up the story of Seleucus. So at the very beginning, if we're to just ignore the other noise and concentrate on the papacy, the United States and the papacy were in an alliance, yes? Time of the end, Ronald Reagan, John Paul II. That alliance crumbles by the behaviour of the United States after 1989. It stays destroyed through the history of 2001, through 2003, all through this history. I'm not sure how just 2 years ago people would have been teaching about this great alliance between the United States and the papacy, all because of what happened in 1989. It hasn't been that way for 30 years now. I'm not sure how that missed at least FFA's attention, but they don't believe in following news. 30 years they haven't had that alliance. We come through 2003 and we find that the papacy has a closer or warmer relationship, especially now with Francis, a more visibly warmer relationship with Vladimir Putin than they do with Donald Trump. Come down here to Raphia. At the Battle of Raphia, you have the United States versus Russia. You have the defeat of the United States. We know that the United States is going to come back, take back that sphere of influence. But in this history, when we see Panium, who begins to rise? We've already done that through the compare and contrast. Do we remember? This for us, 2019, November 9, is what waymark in Christ's history. This is the cross. Or you could go into the 30 years of Christ and call it the wilderness. And God's people are scattered and torn. Then we come into the history of the upper room, the Holy Spirit is given, and then back at Panium, we go back to the church with a message and power, and we begin to grow, yes? And then we do a work here, 34 AD, going to the Gentiles or the world. So we did that compare and contrast with this movement, what we know to expect based on our reform lines, and the counterfeit. All we've done is go to the Third Diadochi War and see how that is reinforced. You have, out of this conflict between the King of the North and the King of the South, you have the papacy take the opportunity to re-establish themselves, lining that up most directly with Panium. But between Panium and the Sunday Law, they're fighting with the United States to have a political voice. Does that make sense? So you have the war, this being marked in history as war between the United States and the papacy. And then at Sunday Law, who wins? The papacy. Does that mean Antigonus somehow lost his power? No, he had all the West. He was still a superpower. But Seleucus had carved out his own territory. Now you had the two superpowers. And we mark from Sunday Law that they then go forward and do a work, just as Seleucus did. Does that all make sense? That's all just to reinforce our story of the Catholic Church in this history divided into two groups. You have the disciples of Benedict and the disciples of Francis. They have been scattered and torn. They have been and are going through a shaking. They look weak, but we know when we come to Panium, prophetically, they're going to rise and become established at the Sunday Law and then do a work for the world. We're all okay with that. I'm going to rub out some of this board, if that's okay, what doesn't directly relate to. So I want to come back to our reform lines of the priests and the reform lines of the world. We're all comfortable that when we come to the Sunday Law, Panem to the Sunday law, there's the rise of the papacy. So 2021 being Panem. We know that in this history we have the rise of the papacy. And then he becomes established at the Sunday law. So I want us to rethink some of the answers that we gave when we dealt with these now a couple of weeks ago. We dealt with our reform line of the priests, and then we went to the reform line of the world. Are we all aware of the difference between these two reform lines? That there's a difference. What's the difference, my brother?
The difference is the cause of operation.
So this is the priests. Here's our Sunday law and our close of probation. So for the priests,
The cause of probation for the priest is at a point.
this is at one point. Everyone at one point in time.
And for the revenues is for this.
But for the Nethinims or the world, their close of probation is what waymark? Daniel 11:41, Sunday law on the line of 144,000. And in this history we give a cry, a loud cry. And what are we saying to them? Come out, my people, and join the movement. Almost all of us in this room, when did we hear that cry? In this history, yes? So if you go to the parable of the 10 virgins, is the cry made before or after the shut door? Before, because that is a parable for the church. So we have midnight, the tarrying time of the bridegroom, then the cry is made, behold the bridegroom cometh, and then the shut door, and that shut door is shut for everyone all at once. And this cry is given in the time period of our latter reign. When you come to the history of the world, in what history is that cry given? Agricultural model. Harvest. So the priests receive a cry saying, come out of her, my people, join this movement. We receive that cry in the history of our latter reign. The world receives a cry saying, come out of Babylon, my people, and they receive that cry in the history of their harvest. Are we all okay with that? That's the difference between the 144,000 and the priests, both have this model, and the Levites and the world both have this model. Any questions or thoughts on that? So difference between the reform line of the 144,000 and priest and Levite and Nethinim. The reason I want to make that point is because to make this compare and contrast, we have to take this history and bring it under ours. We're taking this history of the calling out, lining it up with our history of the calling out. So we're lining up their harvest with our latter rain. But we're doing that because we're lining up their calling out with our calling out. Does that make sense? Okay. So come back to the reform line of the priests. We've already done that because you know this is ploughing, early rain, latter rain. And we want to compare this history with not their latter rain but their harvest. Our latter rain with their harvest. Our midnight cry with their loud cry. Our calling out with their calling out. If that makes sense. So for the reform line of the priests, what is the theme? What is God doing? Why is there a priesthood? Sister Snyder, what is God doing? So give me a theme for the reform line of the priests. Maybe if we thought about Daniel 2, we would have a reference point. Cutting out of where? And what's the mountain? In application, what does that mean? What does that look like? So you have a mountain, and God's going to cut a stone out of that mountain. So the reform line of the priests, reword that. What does that parable mean? Stone, mountain. So the mountain is the Adventist church, and the priests, we can ignore Levites for the moment, the priests are a stone. So this whole reform line is the work of what? You have a mountain, it's the church, and he's going to cut out this group of people from the mountain. And then what in Daniel 2 is this world structure about? The statue. Does the statue lose anything? Does the statue lose anything?
Yes. For these two, like mountain and stone, we also have the chaff and the wheat. So it produces another element.
So the mountain loses something.
Yeah.
So there's something beaten out of, there's something cut out of the mountain and there's something beaten out of the statue.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So this is the story. The priests are the story of something being cut out of the mountain, and this is the story of something being beaten out of the statue. Does that make sense? So this mountain, all this line of the priesthood, from ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest, it's all the story of God reaching into the Adventist church and cutting out a people. So it's us versus who? The Adventist church. Are we okay with that? So what does that look like in reality? We have priests, 1989 to 9/11. In this history of us being cut out of the church, who is Elder Jeff facing off against in this history? This is the movement versus SDA. And when we say movement in this history, who and what do we mean? Because none of us were there. What do we mean when we say movement in this history? Who was facing off against the Adventist leadership? Elder Jeff and FFA. So in the history of our ploughing, you have the movement, the stone being cut out of the statue. And you have this movement, particularly Elder Jeff and Future for America versus Adventist leadership. We're all okay with that. Then we come to the history of our early reign. And now it's this movement versus who? Path of the just. Now we come to this history. This is the history of our calling out. And who are we facing off against? Movement versus Jeff and FFA. Does that make sense? So how come when we're being tested in this history doesn't look like us versus the church, does it? Were we being cut out of Adventism at the midnight cry? Was that the division? No, the division was within this movement, yes? It was us versus Future for America. So what's our problem with our conclusion about our compare and contrast? We all discussed this. What message do we bring to the world? And we all had different ideas. This was where I disagreed with you. This is what everyone seemed united about that I disagree with you about. The two groups in the history of their coming out, we said, was conservative versus liberals. What's the problem with that? Brother.
Because the purpose is liberal, and then the Protestants are also liberal, opposed to Protestants. So if they say conservative and liberals, it's either the people of papacy, the counterfeit, and then the other people of Protestants. So it's like it's mixing two people.
So your problem is the liberals are the papacy. So we're mixing two groups of people if we say liberals. There's another hand. Sorry, can you speak up a little? So you're saying the liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives? Brother Rogers.
So if I've understood what you have read, that's true. In the period of our last reign, the division is not between us from the church, it's within the movement. I don't accept it. When you compare and contrast our last reign with their harvest, it will be between the movement. So it will be within that liberal cycle, whoever separation and division.
So if I can try and point to that on the board, what Brother Rogers just said, in the history of our ploughing, it's us versus Adventism. If you're not benefited by the first angel, can you receive the second? No. So Adventism, what happens to them after this? Are they even relevant to our story? No. The only shakings that can occur after that happen within the movement and are the Adventist leadership within this movement. No. So while this is a whole history of a calling out of Adventism or a cutting out of Adventism, it's here that it's us versus Adventism, and then in this history, particularly in our calling out, it's a division that occurs within this movement. So when we compare and contrast that with the world, here in the history of their ploughing, 14 to 19, it is liberals versus conservatives. But we can't say that it's liberals versus conservatives here. Therefore, in the history of their harvest, in the Sunday law history, it's liberals versus conservatives. Does that make sense? To say that would be to say that in the history of our midnight cry, it's Future for America and Elder Jeff against Adventism. Can we see how that doesn't work? In fact, who is the enemy here? Who's the enemy? The threat. Those who did the ploughing. So who's the threat? Those who did the ploughing. Is that the conservatives or the liberals? The liberals. This is a story of us being cut out of Adventism. But we don't come down to the end and see that dynamic most clearly. Adventism as an institution, as leadership, has been gone for a long time. So when we talk about this reform line of the world, when we come down to here, do we have even to be focusing on Donald Trump and conservative America? How long gone are they? They're long gone. They're gone now. There's no hope for them. You're not going to reach Donald Trump. You're going to have a hard time, if not impossible, to reach one of his supporters, just as you would have a hard time reaching the General Conference president or part of his administration. They're gone. What we need to focus on now is this issue of liberals. Do we have any questions or thoughts so far, Brother Rogers?
What you have explained is very consistent when you bring within the framework of the parable the wheat and the tares. If you come to 9:11, what is planted is the priests. Yeah, that's seed. When you come to the
So you're taking us to the parable of the wheat and tares. What is planted at 9/11 relates to the priests, so that the cutting and the harvest can only happen with what was planted inside that field, within the movement or the priesthood, if that makes sense. The division can only occur, or the shaking, from within the movement, not from those who are not part of that movement. And are the conservatives, Donald Trump's America, part of the movement of Nethinims? No, they have no part in that. As of November 9 last year, they have no part. We read a quote when we began, GC 605.3. What did this quote say? Do we remember the essence of this quote? Can someone summarize it for us? So there's an agitation before the Sunday law. And when we placed it before the Sunday law, what waymark did we go to? Panium. So if we're going to plot that on a reform line, the only place we can go back to is Panium. There's an agitation before it to say this is what is coming. This is the reform line of the world. 5 key waymarks, yes? The middle one is their Sunday law. Panium is their Sunday law. What is a characteristic of the middle waymark? What's some characteristics of this middle waymark? Sister Jennifer. Middle of the 5. 1989, 9/11, Sunday law, close of probation, second advent. It's midway or midnight. What always happens at this middle waymark? What waymark is this for the priests? And what year? 2014. And what happened in 2014 in regards to this movement, organisation?
From 2014, we began to see a split in the movement.
Between what two sides?
On the sides of those who received the message of Catholicism.
So some people received the message of the midnight cry and some didn't. And those who didn't, they had a living leader to look up to. If we were to talk about the counterfeit, we'd say Benedict. If we talk about the internal, we say? You have Benedict, the first angel, Francis, the second angel. In there, we don't have it up here now. We do have it here. In their 5 key waymarks, their first is 2001, their second is 2005, their third is 2013. And what happened in 2013? Transition from Benedict to Francis. We lined that up with 2014 and there was a transition from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder. So at this middle waymark, what do you have? Transfer in leadership. So if we come to the world, Panium is their middle waymark, yes? Prior to that, who's leading them? Who's leading them in this history? If you just want to name one person, or you could give me 2. AOC and Michael Moore. AOC and Michael Moore, if we were just to name people. Are we all okay with that being their leadership in this history? First angel gave the message. So who's their new leadership? Sister Elizabeth. There must be a transfer in leadership. Who's the new leadership? Sorry? Steve Bannon? Can he lead the Nethinims? I'll put him down here. Do you all know who Sean Hannity is?
Yes.
Leading conservative on Fox News, Donald Trump supporter. These are the two conservative voices in opposition. These are the two liberals. I just want to make a point about them. Michael Moore and AOC, they lead from the time of the end to the Sunday law. Does that make sense? Panium, transfer of leadership. Who becomes the new leadership of the world? My sister. You know, over here, you're calling people out, aren't you? You're telling people they have to come out of Babylon and join this movement. With what authority do you do that? What gives you the right to tell them? God's authority? Who's their new leadership? Do they have to listen to you here? You're going to the world. You're saying, come out of Babylon and join this movement. Do they have to listen to you? So who's leading them? If you have a flock of sheep and you say, leave that field, come to this field, who's leading them? There must be a leader. Who's that leader? You said you're telling them to leave. So you're telling the sheep, don't eat over there, eat over here. So who's leading them? You are. Okay, we're okay with that? Does that make sense? So you know you're leading them over here. You're telling them to leave Babylon and they're to join this movement. Or else. It's the only hope. So when do you start leading them? Because you know you're leading them here. When do you start leading them? When do you become their boss? They have to obey you before they join the movement, otherwise they never join. So before here, how far back do you want to go? Here? So you're going to become their boss here. Did we have a leadership change in 2019? No, when's our leadership change? Do we know that it changed in 14? Did people say, wake up in 2014 and say, oh, I'm going to start following Parminder now? People didn't know it, did they? It took them time to know it. So we start following, we have a change of leadership at the Sunday law waymark. So the world, when's their leadership change? Their Sunday law, and when is their Sunday law? Panium. So who becomes their leadership here? Us, this movement. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So at Panium, there's a change of leadership for the Nethinims between those who did the ploughing, symbolised by Michael Moore, AOC, and this movement. From here, this movement takes over leadership. And then who becomes the threat? The conservatives? Adventism? Those who did the ploughing. I want to read a couple of quotes. This is 2009. 2009, Michael Moore is being interviewed by Sean Hannity on Fox News. Two arch enemies. You can watch it on YouTube. It went viral. Michael Moore had just released a new documentary on capitalism. Sean Hannity, the right-wing host of Fox News, and Michael Moore, the left-wing documentary maker, who calls himself a socialist. So you had this right-wing capitalist, left-wing socialist. Sean Hannity, Michael Moore. Sean Hannity asked Michael Moore if he would be willing to describe himself as an unapologetic socialist. So there's Sean Hannity, I'm Michael Moore, and Sean Hannity says, you tell us, in your own words, you admit that you're an unapologetic socialist. And Michael Moore says, no, I'm an unapologetic Christian. How does Michael Moore identify himself as? He's a Christian. Taken aback, Sean Hannity protested and he said, I'm a Christian too. Michael Moore says, but I believe in what Jesus says. So do I, Hannity quickly replies. Michael Moore then narrows it down. He says, you're a Catholic? I'm a Catholic, agrees Hannity. Yes, they both go to Mass each Sunday, which is no great surprise. But when Michael Moore asks Hannity to identify last week's gospel theme, Hannity is clearly shaken and he mumbles that he arrived to church late. Michael Moore explains to him that the message preached at the Catholic Church that week was about the parable of the rich man trying to enter heaven being harder than a camel passing through the eye of a needle. So Sean Hannity and Michael Moore have this debate, and what's the difference between them two? Conservative, capitalist, liberal, socialist, but what do they both have in common? They're both Catholic. Michael Moore is a liberal Catholic, Sean Hannity is a conservative Catholic. What day did Pope Francis become Pope? Do we know the day? It's 2013. Not April 19. It's March 13, 2013. Is 13 a significant number for the Catholic Church in their Omega history? It's the entire symbology of Fatima and Mary, all revolved around the number 13. So 13th of March 2013, Francis becomes Pope. Michael Moore wrote on Twitter, 13th of March 2013, Pope Francis, he's a Jesuit. Jesuits have been a thorn in the side of the Vatican because they ask questions, they're smart, they dissent. I want to read, we spoke about this history of October. October 2018, we had internal streams, true and false, external streams, true and false. And in this history, you have Fahrenheit 11.9, Michael Moore. He's giving the true stream for the world. He does something else in September 2018. For the first time, he visits the Vatican and he visits Pope Francis. I want to quote some things he said about that interview. Michael Moore deeply moved after meeting with Pope Francis. He met with him on the 18th of October 2018. Michael Moore, the director of Fahrenheit 11.9, posted on Twitter, "Today I met Pope Francis for the first time at the weekly general audience he holds at the Vatican. We spoke for a number of minutes. I had a question I wanted to ask him and he gave me his answer. I will write about this tomorrow," Moore tweeted. "For tonight I remain deeply moved and grateful." The pictures show Moore shaking hands with the Pope. Both are smiling. As Francis put his hand over their handshake, Moore appears to whisper something in the ears of Francis. He later described their encounter, what was said. Michael Moore asked Francis, "Do you believe in an economic system that benefits the few, the wealthy at the expense of the many? Do you believe that's a sin?" Francis says, yes, in Italian. More says, do you believe capitalism, the capitalism we have now, is a sin? Francis says, yes, it is. The poor must always come first. Michael Moore describes Pope Francis as a humorous figure and claimed that Francis asked Moore to please pray for him. Francis grabbed my hand and he said, please pray for me. And I said, I will, and please pray for me. And Francis said, no, you have to make more movies. And I'm like, I just wanted a prayer. Francis says, no, you go back to work. You go back to work. So what's the relationship between Francis and Michael Moore? Close. Michael Moore is a strong Catholic. He split with the Catholic Church, stopped attending in the years of John Paul and Benedict. Why? Conservatives. He did not believe in their message, but he's come back under the administration of Francis. And they are ideologically extremely close. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Protestant or Catholic? Catholic. Michael Moore is a Catholic, AOC is a Catholic, and who do they support, Benedict or Francis? Francis. Steve Bannon, Protestant or Catholic? Strong Catholic. Sean Hannity, strong Catholic. These four leading people are not Protestants, they're Catholics. And they represent the opposite two polarized sides of Catholicism. There's an article by, I think it's a French magazine, I won't say it because I'll get La Croix, I think. Pope Francis or Steve Bannon, Catholics must choose. It's stating that if you want to be a Catholic, you have to choose between Francis or Bannon. So we find in the history of their ploughing, they have a choice just like we do. They have a choice between these two sides. But the side doing their ploughing, Michael Moore and AOC, they're supporting Francis. They're supporting the counterfeit. So when we take over leadership of their movement of the world, and we get to this history, when the counterfeit has arisen, do we think Michael Moore will be supporting this movement? No. Who will he be supporting? Francis. So at the very beginning, we had the Adventist Church versus Elder Jeff and this movement. At the very beginning, they have conservative America versus Michael Moore and the movement of the Nethinims. We come to our calling out, and you don't even see Adventism. It's a division within this movement. And the division within this movement is the new leadership versus those who did the ploughing. So in their calling out, the division is the new leadership, us, versus those who did the ploughing. Michael Moore, AOC, Pope Francis. So if we want to know who the greatest threat in this history is, the two groups divided are not conservatives and liberals. Conservatives were divided out of Nethinims in the first dispensation. Does that make sense? So the division into two groups within the Nethinims will be a division between this movement and liberals, after the model of the counterfeit. Do we have any questions or thoughts so far? I think this misunderstanding, this point, has caused, sorry I missed your hand, I'll come back, has caused some of the trouble that we now face when we think of what Elder Parminder discussed this morning about these ideas that have come into the movement regarding what is good advice, what is law, what we are allowed to teach the world, what we require of the world, what vows we should have. There's a few different reasons that we have started to struggle with those things within the movement. The study of dispensationalism is one, when it's misapplied. What we did with the subject of trousers, when that is misapplied. But I also fear that there is this idea within the movement that those liberals who do the ploughing, that somehow they've all of a sudden become our heroes. And I don't see movement videos being shared on Facebook anymore. I see worldly movies. That somehow those liberals are going to come and teach the priests. And people are losing sight of our role, what we were raised up to be, which is the leaders of the world, not the followers of the world. Does that make sense? We've lost some of our identity when we've looked to someone like AOC and we've lifted them up on a pedestal as a hero. And in this history, are they? Can you be a Nethinim and doubt them? They have to have implicit trust in them. Just like people had to have implicit trust in Elder Jeff. One of the reasons we can't go to the world right now, why can't we go to the world right now? One of the reasons is we're not ready. Another reason that's also much kinder to us is that if we were to go to the world right now, our problem is we have prophetic glasses on. Are they supposed to be trusting Michael Moore and AOC? Yes. We have a problem because we can see all this prophetically. And if we went to them right now, what would we say? Did you know your leaders are going to turn on you? Do you know they're going to kill you? What would we have done to people if we said back in 1996, be careful of that, Elder Jeff. It's going to become your worst enemy. You actually can't give them the whole message. So there's a couple of reasons we can't go to the world right now. One of them is we're not ready. The other reason is if we told them what we know, we would destroy them before they're ready for harvest. That crop is not ready for harvest. Does that make sense? Brother Robert, I missed your hand.
So what I wanted is, well, I was making a suggestion. Is it that from 2019 we have been leading SBA because ICT is there, and they're going to come together in this as they're trying to Lithuania.
On the line of the Levites, when is their Sunday law? So when did their leadership change? And when we go to the Levites, what do we say to them? You want to look to your Adventist structural leadership, stop looking at the General Conference. They're not your leaders anymore. Don't we have that message? So I would agree with you. My brother.
Okay, we have seen that the great danger between that the time of harvest of the Negroes is the liberal side. What about of the conservative side? There are some, you see, we have the conservative side in the part of the Protestants, and then also we have the conservative side of the Catholic side. So in Catholic side, harmonize their differences that come together, and then join the conservative side. So there are those you have to find two there.
I'm not quite sure I understood your question, so I'll answer what I think I did understand, and then you can repeat it if I haven't properly. My understanding is that in this history, we know at 9/11 there's a death of the leadership. Adventism is passed by, they're gone. We don't see ourselves fighting them in this history anymore. People want to join, they need to certainly come out of that. But as far as that struggle goes, that's all done in this history. And now it's within this movement. So when it comes to conservative America, I would suggest that by the time we come to the harvest, they weren't benefited by the first angel. If they didn't take anything in of Michael Moore and AOC, they rejected their first angel's message. Ellen White says they can't be benefited by the second, and they certainly can't be benefited by the midnight cry. So the conservatives, as far as joining this movement, I would say their door's shut on that. As a movement, I recognise there's conservatives in some parts of the world who haven't fully been aware, just like as we would expect. So we'll summarise and then close unless anyone has a final thought. We'll repeat this tomorrow. We've looked and tried to establish the rise of the papacy from Panium to Sunday law. So from Panium to here, Francis is rising. In the same history, this movement is rising. There's an agitation about the Sunday law. Everything is stirring up at the same time. We understand that from their ploughing and early reign, they have this leadership that's giving them a message. Michael Moore, AOC, and it's been liberals versus conservatives, just as it was this movement versus Adventism. But what continues to be divided, that division occurs from within the movement, from here on in. So when we find this dispensation, this movement is divided, shaken. In the history of our latter reign, this movement is shaken. In the history of the harvest, you can be sure this movement will be shaken. When we come to the history of the world, yes, conservatives versus liberals in the history of our ploughing. Then we come to the early reign, still being led by that liberal leadership. From Panium, this movement takes over. 2014, people did not know that Elder Parminder was the new leader of the movement. He hadn't even started being reintroduced and teaching yet. But already prophetically, he is the leadership. 2021, no one in the world will know it. It'll take them time, but we become the new leaders of that movement. From their latter reign history, we have to be cautious how we identify Michael Moore and AOC. These are two people closely allied to liberal Catholicism. Both of them are strong Catholics. Both of them see Francis as being this great reformer who's given them hope again in the Catholic Church. They believe in him. As we come into the history of their harvest, when we call them out, our greatest threat is not the conservatives, it's this. Because this counterfeit of Francis will be allied to the Michael Moores and the AOCs that we have today. They will join forces. Elder Jeff became the enemy. Michael Moore becomes the enemy. And this division, it will be within the movement. The conservatives are not part of the movement of the Nethinims, and they'll have to choose between whether or not they want Francis or whether or not they want us, the true or the counterfeit. That starts to impact what type of message we're going to bring. It starts to impact how we see these people, and I'm hoping it starts to impact how we see ourselves. And we can be a little bit more careful as priests when I see Facebook post after Facebook post or WhatsApp group after WhatsApp group that are not adequately following the message of the 144,000 and are going to the world to teach them, which is what we have begun to do in a way that I would suggest is dangerous. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer and repeat tomorrow. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. I pray that you'll give us a better understanding of who we are, not, Lord, to be lifted up, not to become proud or self-important, but to be humbled, to realise the solemn responsibility on our shoulders. May we not pass that responsibility to anyone who does not recognise your movement and your name. May we not follow them. May we follow you and your lions and your leading of this movement. We recognise the trouble we are in this movement, how we have in many ways as individuals failed, how we have been shaken by our attachments to conservatism and the teachings and theology of conservatism. Lord, I pray that we will also identify the dangers of liberalism. Father, that while equality is 100% accurate, 100% inspired, but Lord, that we have an identity as your people that we have had for a few hundred years now, Lord, as you've raised up this end time movement. Lord, and you've given us so much. You've given us prophecy, you've given back the Sabbath to your people, all these different things. May we not lightly esteem a single one of them. I pray, Lord, that we'll take our responsibility seriously and that we'll be able to be appropriate leaders, Father, representing you, all of you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.